The air in the dealership office was thick with the smell of fresh coffee and desperation. It was Smiling Jack's own special blend. He sat behind a wide metal desk, a polished oasis in a sea of greasy parts catalogues and grimy work orders. His real name was Jack Miller, but nobody called him that. To every farmer in 3 counties, he was Smiling Jack, the man who could get you into a brand new John Deere with nothing more than a handshake and a signature that tied a rope around your neck for the next 20 years. "Jedediah, I'm telling you, it's a new age," Jack said, leaning forward, his smile as wide and bright as the chrome grille on the 4430, parked just outside his window. "This old way of thinking, patching and praying, it's holding you back. A man can't get ahead turning wrenches all night. You need to be in the cab, son, making money." I kept my eyes on the parts counter where a pimply kid named Kevin was trying to find a hydraulic pump seal for a 1968 Series 2 Big Bud. I'd given him the part number, 6271N, but he was looking at me like I'd asked for a carburetor for a spaceship. "I get ahead just fine, Jack," I said, not turning around. My hands were stained with 90-weight gear oil from the knuckles down, a condition that soap and water couldn't much change. I could feel Jack's smile tighten a notch. "Fine. Jed, look around you. It's 1972. The Russians are buying every bushel we can grow. Prices are through the roof. Guys are trading up, buying more land. Rick Peterson just signed papers on a new International 1466 this morning. Turbocharged, factory cab with air conditioning. Said he's buying the old Henderson place next to you." That got my attention. I turned slowly from the counter. The Henderson place was a good 80 acres of prime bottomland. Old man Henderson had worked it his whole life, paid for and free, just like my father had taught me. He'd passed on last winter. His kids, scattered to the cities, just wanted the cash. Just then, the door to the office swung open and in walked Rick Peterson himself. He was everything I wasn't. His jeans were creased, his boots were clean, and he wore a seed corn cap that was still the same color it was when it left the factory. He strode in like he owned the place, which in a way he was starting to. "Morning, Jack." "Jed," he said, his voice full of the easy confidence that comes from a healthy line of credit. He nodded at me, a quick, dismissive gesture. "Heard you were in here. Still trying to find parts for that old green monster." "She still runs," I said, my voice low. Rick laughed. It wasn't a mean laugh, just condescending. "Runs? Jed, my new 1466 will do the work of 2 of that thing, and I'll be listening to the radio in a cool cab while it does it." "You gotta leverage yourself, man. Use the bank's money to make your own. It's the modern way." "My father had a different way," I said. "If you can't pay for it in cash, you can't afford it." Rick and Jack exchanged a look. It was a look of pity, the kind of look you give a man who still thinks the world is flat. "Your father was a good man, Jed." "A hard worker," Jack said, his smile returning, now soft and sympathetic. "But these are different times. Interest rates are low. The government is backing the loans. It's a sure bet." The kid, Kevin, finally came back from the warehouse, holding a small, dusty box. "Found it," he mumbled, placing it on the counter. "That'll be $17.42. I pulled a worn leather wallet from my back pocket and counted out a 10, a 5, and 3 ones. I laid the bills on the counter, then dug in my pocket for the change. The clink of the coins on the formica seemed impossibly loud in the quiet office. Rick just shook his head, a little smirk playing on his lips. $17 to keep a museum piece running for another week. Jed, the down payment on a new rig is practically nothing. Think of the fuel efficiency, the productivity." "I think about the payment book," I said, picking up the small box. "I think about what happens when the rain doesn't fall or the prices drop. That payment book doesn't care. It just wants to be fed every single month." I nodded once to Jack, ignored Rick, and walked out into the bright morning sun. The dealership lot was a sea of shiny green and red paint, tractors bigger than my father's first barn, with tires taller than a grown man. They gleamed under the Nebraska sun, silent promises of an easier life. A life on credit. A life where the bank, not the weather, was your ultimate master. I climbed into my old Ford F-250, the vinyl seat cracked and the cab smelling of dirt and diesel. The engine turned over with a familiar grumpy roar. As I pulled out onto the highway, I glanced in my rearview mirror. Rick and Jack were standing in the doorway, watching me go. They weren't smiling anymore. My farm was 5 miles out of town. The farm my grandfather broke the sod on with a team of mules, and my father had built up with a Farmall M and a 2-bottom plow. He'd bought the Big Bud in '69, a year before the cancer took him. It was already used then, a custom-built brute from up in Montana with a roaring Detroit diesel engine. The dealer in Grand Island had taken it on trade and couldn't move it. Too big, too loud, too simple for most folks who were starting to get a taste for comfort. But my father saw its truth. It was built with 1/4-inch steel plate. It had massive Clark planetary axles you could find on a mining scraper. The engine was a 2-stroke 8V71, a diesel that screamed more than it rumbled, a legend for its reliability and ease of repair. There were no computers, no complex electronics, just steel, diesel, and raw, honest horsepower. This tractor, Jed, he'd told me, his voice thin but his eyes clear, is an anchor. While other men are chasing the horizon on ships made of paper, you'll have this. It won't be fast, and it won't be pretty, but it will hold you to the earth when the storms come. He'd paid for it with the profits from 3 good years in a row. Wrote a check and drove it home. It was the last major thing he ever bought. And it, along with the 320 acres of black soil, was mine. Free and clear, an island in a rising tide of debt. Driving home, his words echoed in my head. An anchor. It felt more like a millstone some days, watching guys like Rick Peterson sail on by. Before we go any further, I gotta ask you folks listening, what was the best piece of advice your father or grandfather ever gave you? The kind of advice that sticks to your ribs like a winter breakfast. The kind you find yourself repeating to your own reflection 30 years later. Drop it in the comments below. I'd surely like to read them. I need to know I'm not the only one still trying to navigate by those old stars. The sun was hanging low and orange by the time I got back to the farm. The Big Bud sat silent in the yard, looking more like a locomotive than a tractor. It was massive, articulated in the middle, its 8 huge tires giving it a stance like a bulldog. The paint was a faded industrial green, chipped and scoured by years of work. A patch on the front grille was a different shade, a repair I'd welded myself after hitting a rock hidden in the tall grass. It wasn't a machine you operated, it was a machine you partnered with. And right now, my partner was bleeding. A dark puddle of hydraulic fluid, thick as molasses, had spread on the ground beneath its belly. The seal I'd bought was for the main pump, the heart of the beast that powered the steering and the 3-point hitch. Without it, the Big Bud was just 25 tons of useless steel. I didn't bother changing out of my town clothes. Time was wasting. I slid a big sheet of cardboard under the tractor and shimmied in on my back. The smell of hot metal and oil was close and comforting. This was my church. The frame rails were my cathedral ceiling. I knew every bolt, every grease zerk, every weld by touch. First, I had to drain the system. I found a 5-gallon bucket and positioned it under the drain plug. The plug was a big one, needed a 1.5-inch wrench. I put my weight into it, my muscles groaning in protest. It wouldn't budge. It had been on there for years, tightened by heat and pressure. This was the part Jack and Rick didn't understand. They saw a broken machine. I saw a puzzle, a challenge. I slid back out, grabbed a 3-foot cheetah pipe from the shop and slipped it over the handle of the wrench. More leverage. I lay on my back again, braced my feet against a tire and pulled. The metal groaned, a high, screeching complaint, and then with a sudden violent pop, the plug broke free. Thick, amber hydraulic fluid, still warm from the last time I'd run it, gushed into the bucket. It took 4 buckets to drain it all, 20 gallons of fluid that cost $1 a gallon. A $20 problem before I even got to the real fix. The pump was tucked up high against the transmission housing, a nightmare to get to. I spent the next hour removing the drive shaft that ran it, my knuckles getting scraped and bloodied on the sharp edges of the frame. Finally, with the shaft out of the way, I could see the pump housing. 4 bolts held it on. The top 2 were almost impossible to reach. I had to use a combination of a universal joint, 2 extensions, and a ratchet, feeling for the bolt heads with my fingertips, my arm contorted at an angle nature never intended. By the time the last bolt was out, my shoulders were screaming and sweat was stinging my eyes. The pump was heavy, maybe 50 pounds. I lowered it carefully onto my chest, grunting with the effort, and then rolled it off onto the cardboard beside me. I slid out from under the tractor, covered in a film of grease and dirt, and carried the pump over to my workbench. Under the bare bulb hanging from the rafters, I could see the problem. The old seal was brittle and cracked, pieces of it flaking away like old paint. It had given its all. I carefully cleaned the housing, using a small pick to get the last remnants of the old seal out of its groove. Then I opened the dusty box from the dealership. The new seal was black and pliable. I coated it with a thin film of clean hydraulic fluid and gently pressed it into place. It was a perfect fit. The reassembly was just as hard as the disassembly, only now I was fighting gravity, trying to hold the heavy pump in place with one hand while starting the bolts with the other. By the time I was torquing the last bolt, the moon was high in the sky and the farm was silent, except for the chirping of crickets. I spent another hour refilling the hydraulic reservoir, pouring the new fluid through a funnel with a fine mesh screen to catch any dirt. Finally, it was done. I wiped my hands on a rag, the grit and oil feeling like a second skin. I climbed up the 3 steep steps into the simple open cab. The seat was plain steel. The dashboard had only the essentials: oil pressure, water temperature, tachometer, ammeter. I turned the key. The starter motor groaned, turning the big diesel over slowly at first. Then, with a volcanic eruption of black smoke from the chrome stack, the 8V71 engine roared to life. It wasn't a refined rumble like the new tractors. It was a raw, deafening 2-stroke scream that shook the ground and rattled the windows in the house 50 yards away. The sound of pure, unadulterated power. I watched the oil pressure gauge climb into the green, then I turned the big steering wheel. The massive tires responded instantly. I pulled the lever for the 3-point hitch. The giant steel arms at the back of the tractor rose smoothly into the air. No leaks. She was healed. A wave of satisfaction washed over me, so deep and potent it pushed away all the fatigue. I hadn't signed a paper. I hadn't promised a piece of my future to anyone. I had faced a problem and solved it with my own 2 hands. This machine wasn't a liability. It was my partner, and we were ready for whatever came next. The next morning, I was at the Co-op Cafe for breakfast, a ritual I kept more for the coffee than the company. The place was buzzing. Rick Peterson was holding court in a corner booth, a half-dozen other farmers leaning in to hear him talk. "And with the Henderson place, that puts me at a full section," he was saying, gesturing with his fork. "The banker says I'd be a fool not to. Land's making 20% a year right now. You can't lose." Old man Hemlock, who farmed with a pair of John Deere 4020s he'd bought new in the 60s, shook his head. "That's a lot of debt to be carrying, Rick." "You gotta spend money to make money, Earl," Rick shot back, grinning. "This ain't our daddy's world anymore. We're businessmen now." He caught my eye as I poured cream into my coffee. "Morning, Jed. Get the old girl patched up?" "She's ready to work," I said, taking a seat at the counter. "Good thing," another farmer chimed in. "That storm last night dropped 2 inches. My fields are soup. Gonna be a week before I can get in 'em." A murmur of agreement went around the room. The spring rains had been relentless. The ground was saturated. Modern tractors, with their narrow tires and heavy engines concentrated over 2 axles, would sink to their frames in that kind of mud. Rick just shrugged. "The 1466 has duals. And besides, that's what I've got the Henderson place for. The high ground. I'll start there." 3 days later, the sun came out hot and fierce. The top layer of soil crusted over, but underneath it was still a sea of black mud. I drove my pickup to the edge of my property, the part that bordered the newly acquired Peterson land. I could hear the high-pitched whine of his new International's turbo. He was trying to work the high ground, just as he'd said, but even the high ground was soft. I watched for an hour. He'd get 100 yards, and the big disc behind the tractor would start to pull him down. The dual tires would spin, slick with mud, digging themselves into a deeper and deeper hole. He was making more of a mess than a seedbed. Finally, inevitably, he pushed his luck too far. He tried to cross one small wet patch, and the tractor sank. It went down fast, right up to its axles. The engine screamed as he tried to rock it back and forth, but it was no use. He was stuck, hopelessly stuck. I sat in my truck for a long time, just watching. I could have driven away. It wasn't my problem. Part of me, the small and ugly part, wanted to. But that wasn't my father's way. I drove back to my yard, fired up the big bud, and rumbled out to the field. It moved over the soft ground like a ship on water. Its sheer weight was spread out over 8 huge tires, the pressure on the ground less than a man's footstep. It didn't sink. It floated. I pulled up about 50 feet from Rick's buried tractor. He was standing beside it, his clean jeans now caked in mud to the knee. He didn't look so confident anymore. He just looked tired and angry. I didn't say a word. I got out, grabbed the big log chain from the back of the bud, and slogged through the mud to his front axle. He watched me, his jaw tight. "I didn't ask for your help," he said, his voice sharp. "I know," I said, looping the chain around his frame. I walked back and hooked the other end to the big bud's drawbar. I climbed back into the cab, put the tractor in its lowest gear, and slowly let out the clutch. The Detroit diesel's scream deepened into a guttural roar. The big tires dug in, found purchase, and began to turn. The chain went taut with a sound like a rifle shot. For a moment, nothing happened. The bud strained against the dead weight of the International. Then, with a great sucking sound, the red tractor lurched forward, pulled from the mud's embrace like a rotten tooth. I pulled him all the way to the dry ground at the edge of the field. I got out, unhooked the chain, and started coiling it back up. Rick walked over, avoiding my eyes. He looked at the big bud, at its simple, brutal construction, its sheer size. "Thanks," he mumbled, kicking at a clod of dirt. I owe you one." "No, you don't," I said, hanging the chain back on its hook. "Just be careful. This ground is tricky." I climbed back into my cab and drove away, leaving him standing there next to his shiny, modern, useless machine. It was a small victory, but it felt good. It was a brief, satisfying moment where the old ways proved their worth. But I knew it wouldn't change anything. In the grand scheme of things, it was just a footnote. The world was still turning in Rick's direction. The next few years proved it. The mid-70s were a gold rush for farmers. Grain prices stayed high, fueled by insatiable foreign demand. Land values doubled, then tripled. The mantra from the universities and the banks was hammered into us every day: get big or get out. Debt was no longer a dirty word, it was a tool, an asset. Farmers were speculating on land like Wall Street brokers on stocks. Rick Peterson was the king of this new world. He used the inflated value of his first section of land as collateral to buy 2 more. He traded in the 1466 for a brand new International 2+2, one of those strange-looking articulated tractors with the cab in the middle. He bought a new 6-row corn planter and a 20-foot grain head for his combine. He was farming nearly 2,000 acres, all of it on borrowed money. At the cafe, he was no longer just confident, he was a prophet. The other farmers, seeing his new equipment and hearing the stories of his yields, started following his lead. They traded in their paid-for 4020s and 806 for the new 50 and 60 series tractors. They took out second mortgages to buy the parcel of land next door. The parking lot at Smiling Jack's was always full. And I just kept on working. The money was good for me too. The high prices meant my 320 acres were more profitable than ever. But I saw it differently. I didn't see it as an opportunity to get bigger. I saw it as a chance to get stronger. The first thing I did was pay off the last of the operating note my father had taken out before he got sick. It was only a few $1,000s, but the day I walked into the bank and handed the teller the final payment was one of the proudest of my life. I owned my land. I owned my equipment. I owed nothing to any man. With the profits from the next year, I didn't buy more land. I bought 2 massive fuel tanks and had them delivered to the farm. I filled them both to the brim with diesel when the price dipped in the summer. 10,000 gallons of fuel paid for, a hedge against the inflation that was starting to creep into everything. The year after that, I finally retired my old Gleaner combine. I found a used Alice Chalmers N6, a rotary combine that was only a few years old. A farmer over in the next state had overextended himself and the bank was selling off his equipment. I drove over with a cashier's check in my pocket and bought it for 60 cents on the dollar. It was a monster of a machine and it would cut my harvest time in half. People thought I was crazy. Rick Peterson cornered me at the co-op one day. "Jed, for what you paid for that used combine, you could have made the down payment on the Miller farm. That's a quarter section of the best land in the county. It's for sale. You're sitting on a gold mine with your paid-for land, and you're not using it." "I'm sleeping at night, Rick," I told him. He just shook his head and walked away. From then on, they didn't just see me as old-fashioned. They saw me as a failure, a man who lacked the vision, the guts, to seize the opportunity of a lifetime. My discipline was seen as cowardice, my self-sufficiency as a lack of ambition. The last time I went to the bank in the fall of '79, it was just to deposit the check from the grain elevator. A good year. My bins were full, my accounts were black. Mr. Henderson, the bank president, called me into his office. He was a man who smelled of pipe tobacco and easy credit. "Jedediah, my boy, you've had another fine year," he said, looking at my deposit slip. "A fine year, but I look at your file here and I see potential, untapped potential. Your debt-to-asset ratio is 0. Do you know how rare that is?" "I do," I said. "Son, let us put that equity to work for you." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a confidential whisper. "The old Johnson place is coming up for sale. We could package that with some new equipment, a new tractor maybe. Get you into a nice Steiger, 4-wheel drive. We can set you up with a variable rate loan. The prime rate is a little high right now, but everyone says it's going to come back down. You'll be positioned perfectly for the 80s. Variable rate. The word sent a chill down my spine. My father had taught me about variable rates. He called them fair weather friends. They're low and friendly when the sun is shining, but the moment a storm cloud appears, they turn on you. "No thank you, Mr. Henderson," I said, standing up. "I'm happy with where I am." He sighed, a puff of disappointed air. "You're your father's son, all right. Stubborn. You're missing the boat, Jed." As I walked out of his office, I heard him pick up the phone. "Yeah, get me Rick Peterson," he said. "Tell him the Johnson place is a go. We'll have the papers drawn up tomorrow." I stepped out of the cool, quiet bank and into the warm afternoon air. The town felt different. There were more new cars on the street, the storefronts had been remodeled. Everything looked shiny and prosperous, but it felt fragile, like a beautiful sheet of ice stretched thin over a deep, cold river. That evening, I sat on my porch, listening to the radio. The news came on. The announcer's voice was grave. He talked about inflation, about the Federal Reserve, about a man named Paul Volcker who was determined to break inflation's back, no matter the cost. He talked about the prime interest rate hitting a staggering, unbelievable 15%. And it was still climbing. I looked out across my fields, the stubble golden in the last light of the day. It was mine, all of it. The storm my father had warned me about was no longer on the horizon. I could hear the thunder now rolling in from a long way off. And I knew deep in my bones that many of the paper ships that had sailed so proudly past me were about to be dashed on the rocks. The only question was whether my anchor would be strong enough to hold. The first sign of the turning tide wasn't a thunderclap. It was a whisper on the radio. January 1980. I was in the shop, grinding a new edge on a cultivator sweep, when the news bulletin cut through the country music. A grain embargo against the Soviet Union. A response to their invasion of Afghanistan. The announcer's words were about geopolitics and presidential resolve, but all I heard was the sound of a floor falling out from under us. The Russians had been our biggest customer, the engine driving the boom. Overnight, that engine seized. At the co-op cafe the next morning, the mood was sour. The usual bragging about yields and land prices was gone, replaced by a low, anxious murmur. Rick Peterson was there, but he wasn't holding court. He was staring into his coffee cup like he was trying to read the future in the dregs. "It's temporary," he said to the table, though it sounded like he was trying to convince himself. "The government will make it right. They'll have to. They can't just cut us off at the knees." Old man Hemlock just shook his head slowly. "The government gives with one hand, Rick, and it takes with the other, always has." The price of corn dropped 30 cents a bushel in a week. Soybeans followed. For a man farming a few hundred acres, it was a painful blow. For a man like Rick, farming 2,000 acres on borrowed money, it was a hemorrhage. The math of his operation was built on $3 corn. At $2.50, the numbers didn't just get tight, they inverted. The ground thawed late that spring. When it was finally fit to work, the pressure was on to get the crop in fast. I fired up the big bud and my 24-foot field cultivator and went to work. The big Detroit diesel settled into its high-pitched working scream, a sound that filled the cab and vibrated right through my bones. Day after day, I turned black earth, the simple, honest work a comfort against the worry gnawing at the edges of my mind. One afternoon, I was working the fence line that bordered Rick's new Johnson place when I saw his big International 2+2 sitting silent in the middle of the field. It was a massive, awkward-looking machine, an attempt to get four-wheel drive power without the cost of heavy planetary axles. It was essentially two smaller tractors bolted together in the middle, and it was notoriously complex. I watched for an hour, no movement. Later that day, I saw Smilin' Jack's service truck pull into Rick's yard. The next morning, the tractor was still sitting there. Curiosity finally got the better of me. I drove my pickup over to his place that evening. I found Rick standing in his machine shed, his shoulders slumped. The main hydraulic control block from the 2+2 was on his workbench, a bewildering maze of solenoids, valves, and wiring harnesses. "What's the trouble?" I asked. He didn't look up. "Transmission controller, electronic. Kevin, Jack's mechanic, says the main solenoid pack is fried. Tractor is stuck in 2 gears. Can't move it." "Can he get the part?" Rick let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, he can get it. There's one in the regional warehouse in Des Moines. But it's a sealed unit. They don't sell just the solenoid. You have to buy the whole valve body assembly." He finally looked at me and his eyes were hollow. "It's $3,000, Jed. And it's a week out." $3,000. For a part the size of a shoebox. A week of lost time in the heart of planting season. I thought of the simple gear and lever transmission in the big bud. I could rebuild the whole thing for $1,000 in bearings and seals, and every part was a standard item I could get at any heavy truck supply. "I'm sorry to hear that, Rick," I said. It was all I could think of to say. "Yeah, well," he said, turning back to the useless piece of high-tech steel. "It's the cost of progress, right?" The cracks were showing everywhere. You'd see farmers at the parts counter arguing over a $10 bill. You'd hear hushed conversations in the cafe about guys who were selling off their breeding stock to make an equipment payment. Smilin' Jack's smile was still there, but it didn't reach his eyes anymore. The lot full of shiny new equipment wasn't a sign of prosperity now, it was a liability. A yard full of iron that was depreciating by the day, all of it financed by Jack, who had himself borrowed heavily from the bank to build his empire. His paper ships were taking on water too. The real storm hit that summer. The news from the Federal Reserve was relentless. To fight inflation, they were raising interest rates. Not by a little, by a lot. 10%, 12%. 15. The numbers were abstract, meaningless, until the letters started arriving from the bank. Rick's loans, and nearly everyone else's, were written on a variable rate. When he'd signed the papers, the rate was 7%. It had seemed like a sure bet, but by the fall of 1981, the prime lending rate hit an astronomical 21.5%. His loan payments didn't just go up, they tripled. The money he'd borrowed to make money was now eating him alive. The harvest that year felt like a funeral procession. The yields were good, but the prices were in the cellar. Every bushel we hauled to the elevator was a loss. We were well-paid, hard-working men going broke with every acre we combined. I sold just enough of my crop to cover my taxes and living expenses. The rest I put in my bins. I had the fuel I'd stored. My machines were paid for. My only costs were my own sweat and time. I could afford to wait. Most men couldn't. The first foreclosure notice in the county paper was for a young family just starting out. They'd bought 160 acres at the peak of the market. The notice was a small, dense block of text on the back page, but it felt like a cannon shot. Soon there were more. Every week another name. Families who had farmed the same ground for 100 years were being served papers by the same bankers who had called them my boy just a few years earlier. The auctions started the following spring. They were grim affairs. Neighbors gathered not to socialize, but to watch a man's life be dismantled piece by piece. Tools, tractors, combines, and finally the land itself sold off on the courthouse steps to the highest bidder, which was usually the bank. I went to one. The Miller farm, the quarter section Rick had told me I was a fool not to buy. The farmer who'd bought it was a good man, a hard worker, but he'd leveraged everything. Now he stood by his wife, his face a grey mask, as the auctioneer sold off his dreams. I watched his John Deere 4640, a beautiful, powerful machine, sell for half of what he owed on it. The bank would come after him for the difference. The crisis finally consumed its most ardent apostles. Smilin' Jack's dealership was the first to go. The bank called his notes. He couldn't pay. One morning, the doors were chained shut, a notice from the sheriff taped to the glass. His inventory of new and used equipment was sold at a massive liquidation auction. I went, not to gloat, but to see the end of an era. Jack was there, standing off to the side. He wasn't smiling. He looked like a ghost, a man who had outlived his own world. He'd built his kingdom on the promise of easy credit, and now he was buried under it. Rick Peterson held on longer than most. He was a fighter. He sold off his new equipment at a staggering loss. He tried to farm his 2,000 acres with older, smaller tractors. But it was too much. The debt was a cancer. It didn't matter how hard he worked, the interest compounded faster than the corn could grow. The end came on a cold November day. I was driving past his place and saw the bank's car in the driveway. A few minutes later, Rick came walking out of his house. He didn't get in his truck. He just started walking down the gravel road, his head down, his hands jammed in his pockets. He walked right past my truck without seeing me. I saw his wife, Sarah, standing on the porch, her arms wrapped around herself, watching him go. He had lost it all. The original farm, the Henderson place, the Johnson place, everything. The modern way, the leveraged way, had led him straight to ruin. I went home and sat at my kitchen table, the silence of the house pressing in on me. There was no joy in being right. There was no satisfaction. There was only a deep, profound sorrow for what had been lost. My father's words came back to me, clear as if he were sitting across from me. This tractor, Jed, is an anchor. The storm had come, fiercer than any of us had imagined. And my anchor had held. The winter that followed was the quietest I can remember. The fields lay dormant under a blanket of snow, and it felt like the whole county was holding its breath. The economic news was still grim, but the panic had subsided into a long, grinding depression. More than half the farmers I knew had lost their land. The ones who survived were the ones like me, the old-timers who had resisted the siren song of debt, or the lucky few who had inherited their farms free and clear. One morning in early spring, there was a knock on my door. It was Rick Peterson. He looked thinner, older. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by a deep weariness in his eyes. He wore an old, patched work coat, and his hands were calloused in a way they never had been before. "Jed," he said, his voice quiet. He wouldn't meet my gaze. I heard you might be looking for some help this spring." He'd lost the farm, but he and Sarah had managed to keep their house in town. He'd been working at the tire shop, busting truck tires for minimum wage. It was honest work, but it was killing his spirit. I looked at him, standing on my porch, a man stripped of everything but his pride, and even that was hanging by a thread. I could have said no. I could have savored the moment, the final absolute vindication, but all I saw was a neighbor in need. "I could use a hand," I said. "Planting season is coming up. Pay's not great, but it's a full day's work." His head came up, and for the first time I saw a flicker of the old Rick. Not the arrogant prophet of debt, but the young man who had once loved the smell of turned earth. "I'd be grateful for it," he said. He started the next day. I put him on the old John Deere 4020 I used for lighter work, pulling the planter. At first he was awkward, quiet. We worked for days without saying much more than was necessary, but slowly the rhythm of the work began to heal something in him. The long hours in the field, the sun on his back, the steady chug of the old diesel engine, it was a language he understood. One afternoon, we were fixing a broken planter chain. He was holding the wrench while I lined up the master link. "You know," he said, breaking the silence, "I used to think this old stuff was junk. A waste of time, always breaking down." "Everything breaks down eventually," I said, tapping the link into place. Yeah, he said, looking out at the big bud parked at the end of the field. But you can fix this. That 2+2 I had. When it broke, I was helpless. I had to call a guy with a laptop, to fix a tractor. It was like I didn't even own it. The bank owned the note, and the company owned the technology. I was just the guy who made the payments. He paused, tightening the bolt. You never made that mistake. We all thought you were crazy, stuck in the past, but you weren't. You were just free. That was it. That was the vindication. It wasn't in his ruin, but in his understanding. He finally saw that the chains of debt were heavier than any log chain, and that true wealth wasn't measured in acres, but in autonomy. We finished the planting, and he stayed on through the summer, cultivating and spraying. He was a good worker, a natural farmer. We found an easy rhythm, a friendship forged in the shared work. That fall, the Henderson place, the 80 acres of prime bottomland that had started it all, came up for auction for the second time. The bank had bought it back from the first failed farmer and had been leasing it out. I went to the courthouse with a cashier's check in my pocket, money I had saved, dollar by dollar, over the good years. There weren't many bidders, the credit was gone, and the cash was scarce. I bought the land for a fraction of what Rick had paid for it a decade earlier. I bought it free and clear. The next day, I found Rick in the shop. I laid the deed on the workbench. I bought the Henderson place, I said. He looked at the paper, then at me. His face was unreadable. Good for you, Jed. It's good land. I'm not going to farm it, I said. I've got enough to handle. I was thinking of leasing it out. He understood immediately. His eyes welled up. Jed, I can't. The lease will be fair. I cut him off gently. A simple crop share agreement. No banker looking over your shoulder. You make the decisions. You build it back. You and Sarah. He just stood there for a long moment, then he nodded, unable to speak. He picked up a wrench and turned his back to me, pretending to tighten a bolt on the cultivator, but I could see his shoulders shaking. Over the next few years, the farm economy slowly began to recover. Prices stabilized, the rains came. Rick worked the Henderson place with a vengeance. He bought an old International 806 and a 4-row planter, all for cash. He farmed smart, kept his costs low. He and Sarah started to build their life back, one harvest at a time. The community began to heal too. The talk in the cafe was different now. It was about fixing things, about making do, about helping a neighbor get his crop in. The ones who were left were survivors, and there was a quiet respect among us, a bond forged in adversity. Years passed. The world turned. I never got any bigger. My 320 acres, plus the 80 I leased to Rick, were enough. I eventually bought a slightly newer combine, another used one, paid for with cash. But I never sold the big bud. It sat in the machine shed like a sleeping giant, a monument to a philosophy. My nephew Ben started spending his summers on the farm. He was a city kid, but the land called to him. He had my father's eyes and my hands. I taught him how to read the sky, how to listen to an engine, how to tell by the feel of the soil if it was ready for the seed. One warm evening in the late 80s, we were sitting on the porch, watching the heat lightning flash on the horizon. Ben was 16, tall and strong, his mind full of the future. "Uncle Jed," he said, "why don't you ever get a new tractor? A modern one? With a cab and air conditioning and a computer?" I smiled and took a sip of my iced tea. I didn't point to the graveyard of modern machinery at the edge of town, where the bank's repossessions were slowly rusting into the weeds. I didn't tell him the full story of Rick or Smiling Jack or the dozens of others who had chased the paper horizon. Not yet. Instead, I just nodded toward the big machine shed. "Because, son," I said, "true power isn't about how fast you can go or how much you can borrow. It's about what you can hold on to when the storm comes. It's about knowing that when everything else fails, you can walk out to that shed, turn a key, and hear the sound of your own freedom roaring to life." He looked at the shed, then back at me, a question in his eyes. He didn't fully understand. But he would. I would teach him. That was my legacy. Not the land, not the money, but the hard-won wisdom. The knowledge that the best anchor is the one you forge yourself out of steel and sweat and stubborn, unshakable principle. And as the sun set, casting a long shadow from the machine shed, I knew it was an anchor that would hold for generations to come.